Are you trying to understand the eminence of real-world assets and the DeFi world? Then you're welcome to Link to the Chain, a podcast brought to you by BSOS. This podcast is designed to help you understand the happenings of decentralized finance along with real-world assets. I'm your host, Grusha here from BSOS, and I will be inviting my colleagues and experts from the Web3 industry to share with you their experiences and ideologies on RWA and the DeFi world.
In this episode, I'm pleased to be joined by TJ, who used to work at MakerDAO. He can be said to be a connoisseur in the field of real-world assets in the DeFi world.
It's great having you, Teach, on our podcast. We've been trying to get you for quite some time now, and finally we are able to. And we would like to get as much of information as we can from you. So welcome on Link to the Chain. Why don't you begin by telling us something about your background and what got you interested in blockchain and RWA?
Sure. So my background is in fairly nitty-gritty finance. I traded commercial mortgage-backed securities and some asset-backed securities for about 4 years. Kind of a classic buy-side Wall Street gig. Quit that when I was sort of fed up with the hierarchical structure and sort of lack of nimbleness. Went to Turkey for a while with my quarter-life crisis. I came back and decided in my insanity to enter crypto, really in the only sort of corner that I knew how, which was at this intersection of real-world assets and crypto.
Oh, that's wonderful. Then you went to Turkey. Wow, that's a beautiful place. Talking about real-world asset in the current scenario, there are a few RWAs which have representation on the chain, right? But at the same time, there's a vast portion of RWAs which has not been transcribed onto the chain. So I consider you to be a RWA wizard. Can you share, according to your observation, what kind of asset class has a very high demand or utilization on the chain?
Sure. Yeah, I don't know about Wizard, but I've definitely seen a lot of the ways not to tokenize real-world assets, so maybe I can speak to those. I think thus far the successes in terms of mobilizing real-world credit assets and representing them on chain have come kind of from the two tails of the asset universe. On one side, you have sort of big prime liquid assets like U.S. Treasuries and investment grade structured credit. And then on the other side, potentially more interestingly, you have sort of the long tail of emerging market assets, namely SME loans of the sort you see on kind of Goldfinch and Credix. I think for someone like Maker, we experimented with a number of different asset classes, passing and deciding not to mint DAI against most. But I think what we figured out is right now for a protocol like Maker, which really should act as a decentral bank, a very low risk sovereign issuer of currency, it makes sense, especially with the huge spreads between the on-chain rates, which are very low, and the risk-free rate in the real world, i.e. the rate you pay to lend to the US government. That spread should be captured and it should be ported on chain. Sort of a it's kind of a carry trade. And so Maker does that, right? It lends against treasuries, or it mints DAI against treasuries, and then it passes. Yeah, so I think while Maker has been given a lot of credit, and I'm proud of the work that we did there for sort of ushering in this era of RWAs on chain. I think for the most part, the RWAs that are most interesting to tokenize and to kind of bring into the universe of crypto are those asset classes that are sort of undercapitalized, underrepresented, and underinvested in, which is why I think sort of the emerging market stuff is sort of at a very default level more interesting to pursue. It's also going to entail more losses because those markets are just trickier. But I think ultimately the big liquid asset classes, while they probably need to be reledgered and brought on chain, you're only making a really incremental improvement in terms of onboarding those assets into a different universe. Whereas there's all these assets out there in the world that don't have access to super liquid prime capital markets, and I think that's where we can make the biggest dent.
Now, here you're talking about the new kinds of RWA that will get onboarded on the chain. So, if we are talking about like a comparison is to be done between the already existing RWAs and the ones that are supposed to be got onto the RWA, or which will take a native birth on the blockchain, which one, according to you, will have a brighter future? The ones that are already existing, or the ones that will be new to the chain?
Yeah, so I think, we think the promise lies in unlocking new modes of economic activity. So giving
Mhm.
birth to novel assets. I think if you think about a historical analog for figuring out which of those two categories is going to be more interesting and more explosive, you can just think back to the beginning days of the internet. Right when the internet came around, the first sort of category of experimentation was really in terms of taking radio and taking magazines, sort of existing formats of information, and simply, pasting them onto new internet rails, right? I think that's where we're at in terms of crypto right now.
Mhm.
And that's where you take, treasuries and bonds and commercial real estate, asset classes that have existed for literally decades and have been spliced and diced and are fairly efficiently accounted for in capital markets, and you just sort of copy paste them onto crypto rails. I don't think that's where that's not where the disruption is. That's where the incrementalism is, and I think it's worth doing, right? Because ultimately, if crypto is to fulfill its potential, whereas the sort of internet, was the world's backend for information, then crypto will be the world's backend for value. Um, and so that work needs to be done. But I think the more interesting applications and, where the unicorns lie, if you will, are in terms of
Mhm.
minting completely novel asset classes that we don't even know exist today.
Talking about disruption, you just mentioned about disruption. We know that there are so many assets that are going to be there on the chain, and we will need standardization, or you can say securitization of these assets. And people are not going to agree very consensually that, okay, let's just go with this kind of standardization. How do you think, with so much of diversification, the boat of standardization is going to float in the blockchain world?
Yeah, standardization is one of those kind of tricky things because everyone in the space, I think, acknowledges intuitively that a standard would be useful in
Mm-hmm.
reducing friction and unlocking economic activity. Yet,
Yeah.
no one wants to give in to a competitor's standards. They want to define the standard for themselves, and we've seen this play out so many times, right? With the sort of TCP/IP pre-TCP/IP protocol wars with Xerox and IBM, and
Yeah.
what ended up being the winning solution there was a sort of a thin protocol that accrued no value and allowed for various different builders to build applications on top of it. So I think the same principle applies to on-chain RWAs. I think there are sort of basic building blocks that need to be standardized in sort of a thin way for any of this activity to occur. And one of those is, probably talk about this later if I were to guess, is sort of a permissioning standard for KYC AML. What you're basically talking about here is, RWAs it's sort of a euphemism for building the bridge between meat space and crypto.
Mm-hmm.
And when you build that bridge, what you basically need to do is forge a link between on-chain consensus and off-chain enforcement.
Yeah.
The nature of a lot of these assets is, ultimately when times are good, it's fine. You can link the two worlds, crypto and off-chain. The rent is coming in, or the investment yield is coming in. You port that on chain, all is well. But what's tricky is when things go wrong and assets need to be foreclosed upon, and there are messy processes that involve courts and lawyers. And forging that connection is sort of a really important building block, such that any of this interesting on-chain sort of liquidity transformation or distribution transformation can occur. So something like KYC and AML, I don't exactly know what the standard looks like. It doesn't strike me as all that interesting a problem, but basic things, KYC, AML, off-chain credit score, on-chain credit score, bundled into a package that anyone can use, is something that's probably fairly important. I think on the other side, which is, I think where on-chain has a potential to move the needle in terms of welcoming broader capital formation in asset classes, particularly those that are underrepresented, is having a standard for slicing for yield and slicing up that yield and distributing it. So I think something like an ERC 4626 would be fairly interesting as a
Mm-hmm.
way to take what are non-fungible RWA yields
Yeah.
and overlay them with a standard that's kind of arbitrarily composable across different applications. I think that's kind of like the holy grail that a lot of us are hoping for. This idea of
Mm-hmm.
taking disparate heterogeneous yields and putting them into a package that can be arbitrarily distributed on chain, sort of programmatically. I think that's very interesting. I don't know if 4626 is it, but I think that kind of ties out the both the opportunities but the inherent difficulties with getting to a standard in a new place where there's a lot of frontier to be captured.
Exactly, that's true. People have their own opinions. They want to impose their own standardization. With that, if I'm supposed to ask you what about your imagination of a standard ID, or you can say like if we are connecting it to off-chain, in off-chain, a standard ID for everyone is their passport. So what if everyone has a passport on the chain? So how would a standard passport, according to your imagination, that it's completely personal, how would it look like? Or what attributes or features you would like for the standardized passport on the chain to have?
Yeah, I mean, frankly, I think most of what's required for a standardized passport is, fairly basic stuff that exists in the real world and would give the counterparty, whether it's a borrower or a
Mhm.
lender, comfort in kind of the credit worthiness of the other counterparty. So, KYC and AML are obviously a key component here to get anything done in the real world. I think a sense of reputation is where you can potentially be a little bit more innovative in terms of
Mm-hmm.
what the properties of reputation look like. If we
Yeah.
take kind of the real world standards at the moment, your reputation in terms of, let's say, being a borrower, you want to borrow $80 million to buy a commercial real estate building, your quote unquote reputation is in, your track record, history of bankruptcy, your net worth and your liquidity,
Mm-hmm.
um, things of that nature. So I think that that piece is where you could potentially add a component of your sort of on-chain track record, your sort of history of fulfilling obligations on-chain across some wallets that can be attached to you as an entity. So I think those things, an idea of reputation and creditworthiness, as well as a KYC AML check, are kind of the basic properties required for an on-chain passport.
Yeah, like properties that could reduce the default rate even more or less, though it's very negligible right now, but still.
Yeah, I mean, I also think on this point, right, and something we think about a lot at the new company I'm building, Entheos, is what you want to be able to do in an efficient lending market, right, is allow for borrowers to secure um, whatever sort of assets they have. And what I mean by that is in secured lending, it's fairly simple. You secure some sort of physical hard asset that the lender
Mm-hmm.
can foreclose upon. But there's also this idea of being able to access unsecured lending and securing, your reputation, securing your trust, securing your cachet in the market. And that's why folks will lend to, Apple and Google without, taking any collateral. And I think in any sort of mature lending market, you need to
Mm-hmm.
have the ability for borrowers to collateralize both of those types of assets. And I think that this is where, when folks criticize the fact that, someone like Maple, which I think is a great protocol,
Mm-hmm.
they did unsecured lending to market makers. In some sense, in hindsight, of course, you can say that that was risky, but you need
Yeah.
both sides of this market for a mature lending market to come together. And I think on the unsecured side, right, you can do some fairly interesting things in terms of, getting comfortable around lending to a borrower without them pledging collateral, such as finding a methodology that,
Mm-hmm.
takes that borrower's on-chain track record and manufactures it into some sort of a credit score or reputation score that enhances whatever their existing credit profile is. I don't think anyone's quite cracked that.
Yeah.
But I think the spectrals of the world are working on it, and I think we'll have some very interesting sort of applications come out of that.
Yeah, it's we all are looking forward to that because I think so currently having your identity on the chain is something that people are looking forward to. Obviously with RWA on the chain, identity is also another thing that people want to work on and bring more and more to it. Moving on from that, we like I want to ask you about the asset management policies. Like there are prominent DAOs and they are lacking asset liability management policies. So like they are not being able to manage their balance sheets efficiently. So if any protocol could solve this problem, they can actually attract a lot of TVL for themselves, right? So what kind of DAO treasury management solutions, in your point of view, has the greatest potential? What do you think?
Sure. So I think the first thing to focus on is, it's not for most DAOs, it is not their core business to manage a balance sheet, right? So, like many businesses in the real world, DAOs for the most part are startups. They deal with changing conditions. They're trying to build towards minimal viable products that work and start to get some revenue spun up.
Hmm.
It is very expensive in terms of human resources and opportunity costs to also be an expert in asset liability management. So I think for the most part, across crypto, ALM is a huge issue. But I don't think the solution is to necessarily staff up and divert resources towards solving it. For someone like MakerDAO, right, ALM is our primary business, right?
Yeah.
We are minting sovereign currency that people trust to maintain its peg to the US dollar. By definition, your collateral needs to be well matched to that profile. So ALM is our job, right? And I think, over the course of the years, it's been a little bit of a wild ride, but we finally backed into with help from my buddies over there, Mark, Adrian, and Seb, a pretty
Hmm.
robust policy for in terms of the tenor of assets, the liquidity profile of assets, and the risk of assets. But for the rest of the DAOs, it's just not primary for them. And I think there is this huge opportunity for this middleware of service providers who do understand ALM to go and mobilize those assets in kind of the right way. I think your point is good about a good ALM policy being able to attract TVL, but I think it's a little bit more. I think it's less direct correlation, and more so a function of it's more so a function of the market being comfortable with the sort of with the safety and the policies of a given protocol. I think if these DAOs get their ALM policies together, and they don't have a balance sheet that is 100% exposed to ETH, right? And they don't have a balance sheet that is 100% USDC that's yielding nothing, but something somewhere in the middle where they're taking enough risk to get yield on their assets,
Hmm.
but they're not taking so much risk that the market is worried about them going bankrupt. I think what that basically allows for is it allows you to generate a little bit of yield and be able to pay your people and grow your resources and build towards a product that the market wants, which then, in a roundabout way, increases your TVL.
Yeah, with that, you were just talking about yield, right? So, like MakerDAO's PSM reserve, they didn't reinvest efficiently currently, right? But they were able to like make a meet. They were able to get a yield demand, like efficient yield demand. What's your viewpoint on that?
Yeah, so I think what you're alluding to is, the PSM is this mechanism that's been built to help DAI maintain its peg to USD, and for a long time, we held a lot of stablecoins within that module, with with very little yield, kind of coming back to us. And more recently, that has changed, as the sort of issuers of the stablecoins that sit in the PSM. So, over time, Maker was able to, make it clear that, should those stablecoin providers not reward us for the
Mm-hmm.
service we're providing, which is basically this this fungibility across stablecoins in crypto. If you know that you can swap USDC or GUSD for DAI costlessly in an instant, trustlessly, that's a valuable service, right? That increases the liquidity profile and risk profile. Increases the liquidity profile, decreases the risk profile of both of those non-DAI stablecoins, and we should be rewarded for that, right? And so more recently, both of those issuers, as well as frankly any issuer that wants to be part of this really valuable module that is the PSM, is going to have to reward DAI holders for kind of taking that swappability risk. And I think that's a really important upgrade to Maker's revenue profile, but also in terms of it pushing towards an efficiency in the market that just wasn't there 18 months ago.
Yeah, that's okay. That's interesting, and thank you for that information. That's kind of clear for us. So, if I'm supposed to, you were mentioning about MakerDAO. So, what aspect of DeFi, or you can say the entire blockchain in general, provided you or MakerDAO, if we are looking at the bigger picture, with the affirmation that there is a futuristic confidence in the RWA section?
Um, I think I have a slightly different take on this than I think the broader, Maker token holder, Maker core unit, DAI holder community. I think the reason Maker pursued RWAs is very simple. So if you think about Maker's core business, 2.5 years ago, it was crypto native lending. So mint DAI against Ether, mint DAI against wrap BTC. The problem with that business is really twofold. One is you have very high beta with the broader crypto market. And so you can only grow if the crypto market grows. And so that constrains your ability to expand DAI's footprint. The other thing is, if you think about maintaining a peg to USD, it can be more difficult to maintain that peg if you are exposed to volatile assets. And so the community said, hey, let's explore integrating with more stable crypto uncorrelated yields from the real world in order to make the revenue profile of the DAO more robust to crypto, B, DAI's footprint more broad, and C, DAI's backing more resilient. I think for me, it's actually much simpler. And I think Maker's pursuit of RWAs is a microcosm of where the entire industry needs to go, which is for blockchains to fundamentally transform the way we do business on Earth. You must integrate with the real world. There's not an option. Otherwise, we sort of just remain in this kind of circular, insulated little casino, which is fine and fun and interesting and whatever. But we need to build this bridge such that blockchains fulfill their potential. And so I think Maker sort of, with its balance sheet, was able to usher in a kind of new era of on-chain experimentation with RWAs. And what we really love to see is that the Maples and the Centrifuges and the Credixes and the Goldfinches of the world all experimenting in their corners and how to safely mobilize RWA yields and bring them on chain. So I think it's really just something that kind of has to happen, and all you needed was someone with the risk appetite and the kind of frankly the luxury of a balance sheet to push us in that direction.
Talking about bridging the gap between the real world and the off chain. So, if RWA is coming onto the chain, there is definitely tokenization that needs to be done, if I'm not wrong, or securitization that's need to be implemented. So, what do you think MakerDAO, if MakerDAO was supposed to give an opinion about this, or if you were supposed to give your personal opinion about this, what kind of token standard would be widely accepted for RWA?
I'm not sure. We talked a little bit about there being two different components of this. One is the idea of tokenizing and slicing up the yield, i.e., distributing liquidity, and the other is in finding a standard for really bridging the differences between real-world lending requirements and on-chain lending requirements. So that's that KYC AML. But I think frankly the idea of tokenization of real-world assets has really been deeply misunderstood. I don't think most people who say or who are excited about quote unquote tokenizing RWAs really they haven't deeply considered what it means to tokenize a real world asset. I think there are kind of two components in my view. So one
Mm-hmm.
is the idea of representation. So, what is the asset that you're quote unquote bringing on chain? What does it mean? What is its yield? Who are the counterparties, et cetera, et cetera. The other component, which is much, much more difficult to, imbue a token with, is this idea of ownership or recourse. So, when push comes to shove and, you as a lender need to have the ability to foreclose on an asset, does whatever this token standard is, does it have enough consensus across the right parties required for you to get your clause into that asset? And I think that's
Mm-hmm.
what's a lot more, frankly, complicated. And so, on the tokenization side, I think again where the more interesting applications come from is when we find novel ways, whether by ledgering economic activity in a more robust and resilient way, or really through any other means, to give rise to new asset classes that don't already have consensus about who owns them, how they're foreclosed upon, how they work, what they are. Because I think that gives you a broader design space that's less sort of path dependent on existing systems to really do de novo tokenization because you're building these systems for the first time. And that's why for me and kind of this next stage of life, it's more so about tackling a new problem that really we haven't really nailed correctly, which is sort of renewable energy yields and particularly smart battery cash flows,
Yeah.
and using underlying blockchain technology to ledger and track those assets in a more robust way, such that we can mint new assets that literally don't exist today.
Okay, that's interesting. Yeah, well, now that we have moved to the part about talking on MakerDAO, so I had this question in mind. Like, Vitalik named DAI as a DAO governed RWA backed stablecoin, and MakerDAO generates more than half of its yield from RWA. So there's a lot of potential there with only 12%, if I'm not wrong, 12% RWA asset, but generates 57% of yield. So will MakerDAO keep open risk exposure towards RWA?
Yeah, I mean, look, the trade here is very clear, right? I think what Maker is doing is it is moving slowly but surely towards a higher RWA exposure and a
Mm-hmm.
higher liquid RWA exposure on top of that. And I think those two things move in parallel, right? We talk a little bit about ALM. You can't move to an over reliance on RWAs if they're highly illiquid. And if stuff goes wrong, you can't get them on your balance sheet. But if you look at the way that Maker's balance sheet is broken down right now, a preponderance of the RWA exposure is to the risk-free rate or highly liquid U.S. Treasury ETFs and investment grade structured credit. I think that's kind of the way you're going to have to do it for
Mm-hmm.
the midterm and the long term. And what that does, right, is Maker's in this unique position because it can, for the moment, we'll see how sustainable this is, go ahead and mint DAI out of thin air for 0% cost of capital, and then
Okay.
lend it to the U.S. government, right, by buying
Mm-hmm.
treasuries, its RWA
Yeah.
book, and then pocket the difference between that, right? That is a
Okay.
that is a that is a banker's dream. Banks run they're a net interest margin business. They borrow at a low rate and they lend out against riskier assets. So that is what Maker is doing at the moment, and it's sort of a golden era for that strategy. We'll see if it
Mm-hmm.
continues, but the beauty is for DAI holders, what they can do is, without really any regulatory risk, hold DAI and be paid the DAI savings rate, which is currently 1%. Maker
Yeah.
pockets the difference, and everyone wins. So I think for the moment, all of the experimentation that we did at Maker in terms of onboarding RWAs really got us to the point as a DAO where we'd gone through enough brain damage and we'd made enough mistakes and we'd made enough progress such that Maker is in this actually really interesting position where it is generating a lot of revenue in a bear market, a
Mm-hmm.
lot of revenue in a bear market with a fairly lean set of core units and employees at the moment. And I think it's really set up pretty well at the moment to continue thriving in this environment.
More of a win-win situation.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, so with that, I would just ask our last question that we have with us. What is MakerDAO's picture for the future by keeping RWA as the subject of the painting?
So it's a good question, guys. I've been moved on from my work at Maker for about 4 months, and the nature of these communities, which are so passionate and moving a million miles a minute all the time, is being out of the community. You lose the zeitgeist very quickly. So I guess that's a long-winded way of saying I'm not sure. I've moved into greener pastures, but I think
Okay.
what I would hope for Maker is that it does sort of two things. So one
Mm-hmm.
is, if you think about Maker's role in the ecosystem, it looks like a decentral bank, right? It can mint currency. It has a treasury. And
True.
people trust it to continue minting currency in a way that is safe and
Mm-hmm.
backed by real assets. If you think about the
Okay.
way a central bank sits in the real world, a central bank, when it mints currency, it doesn't then go lend against risk assets itself, right? It knows that its specialty is not in those domains. So instead, what it does is it lends to commercial banks via its discount window and allows them to go take risk in the real world, which is their core business.
Mm-hmm.
Um, if you think about where Maker is right now, Maker is slowly moving from a sort of a commercial bank where it lent against assets directly to a model where it lends to other specialists who then lend long against assets, right? So it has sort of exported that risk sort of outside the bounds of Maker. I think what I would love to see in the long run is a way for Maker to get comfortable and build the systems required such that it can effectively write credit lines to the other RWA protocols, the specialists in the space, right? A discount window with Maple, a discount window with Credix, a discount window with Centrifuge, which we sort of already have, discount window with the TrueFis of the world and the Goldfinches of the world. I think that's ultimately the model you want to step into, one where Maker does what it's best at, which is ALM. Maker does what it's best at, which is mint DAI. And these
Mm-hmm.
commercial banks of RWA DeFi do what they're best at. The other thing is, and I've really flip-flopped on this, Rune, for a very long time, has been interested in transforming the personality of DAI. The idea that there are holders of a currency that will hold it not just because of its yield benefits, but because of sort of the philosophy behind it. And I'm still mixed on that, but I'm coming around, especially because it's not always obvious what edge DAI has if the DSR is turned off. Do users really care about decentralization? Maybe not. But what might the sort of crypto native, digital native power users of the future internet care about? I think it's pretty clear that folks care about a sort of renewable revolution and a green, sustainable future. And so if DAI could find a way to increasingly have a profile and personality of being clean or green money,
Mm-hmm.
I think that would broadly be an interesting tactical choice. So what I would love to see Maker do as it goes forward, outside of sort of opening this discount window to crypto native commercial banks, is find a way to safely mobilize the world in a direction that is more sustainable rather than continuing to drive money into kind of legacy assets.
Okay, thank you so much. That was elaborate and interesting for us. And just you just mentioned, if I'm not wrong, the pronunciation NTS, right? You are working on that currently. Maybe down the lane we will be able to talk about that more. I'm looking forward to it. I want to know more about it. I'm intrigued.
Yeah, I would love to talk about it with you guys at some point. Obviously, there's a lot we're building right now, and we're moving pretty quickly.
Hmm.
So, I can't talk a whole lot about it. But very soon we hope to be a bit more public about this crazy idea we have in terms of launching a cloud of millions of smart batteries that manage electrons to drive local energy independence at global scale. But we'll talk about that next time, and I very much appreciate you guys having me on and letting me rant.
It was wonderful having you. Maybe in the future, when NTS is public, you can come on our Link to the Chain and we can discuss about that.
I would love that, guys. Thank you very much, and happy Chinese New Year.
Oh, thank you so much. Thank you. Thank you for your time, Teach. Thank you so much.
All right, guys, stay frosty. Thanks. Bye.
Thank you for listening, and if you enjoyed this episode, please don't forget to subscribe to Link to the Chain and share it with others. To catch all the latest from us, you can follow the official Instagram and Twitter page at Link to the Chain. Looking forward to sharing with you guys the next episode. Stay tuned.